Thank you for that mild applause, mild applause. We understand that it has been quite a day. I can only imagine the volume of things that you people have been absorbing, but we promise that we're not going to waste your time. My name is Brian Vines, and I have the honor of moderating the panel with four of the smartest people who I've recently gotten a chance to become acquainted with, and now I'm going to give you that pleasure right now. So closest to me is Donna Graves. She's a historian and urban planner based in California, where she develops interdisciplinary public history projects that account for new ways of thinking about cultural heritage conservation. Her most recent work includes studies on LGBT historic sites in San Francisco and intangible resources of the city's historic Japantown. Next to Donna is Kamau Ware. He's an artist and historian, best known for his flagship storytelling project, Black Gotham Experience. Now, it's a visual storytelling project founded in 2010 that celebrates the impact of the African diaspora on New York City through a series of walking tours and graphic novels. Good combination, yes? And then we have Ms. Antoinette Jackson. She's joining us from the University of South Florida, where she teaches anthropology and directs the Heritage Research Lab. Dr. Jackson completed a 4-year federal appointment as the regional cultural anthropologist for the U.S. National Park Service in May of 2016, and she's led numerous research projects and publications on the very subject of heritage. Thanks, Dr. Jackson, for being here. And finally, Jane Weissman is the co-director of the community mural organization Artmakers, Inc. And she served as the director of Green Thumb, New York City's community gardening program, for well over a decade. And between the years of 1984 and 1988, Jane has curated exhibitions and co-authored books that highlight the cultural contributions of New York's diverse neighborhoods. So please just give our panel a little more steam right now. Oh yes, you're here. The caffeine is kicking in. All right, so I'm gonna get just a little closer to these guys and we can make our conversation just a little more intimate. Want to remind you that we are still utilizing that Slido, keep me honest. They're so helpful. Slido.com. So as the spirit moves you, shoot some questions up. All the good ones I'm going to claim as mine. But thank you guys for being here. So at the risk of alienating all these folks who've spent their entire day here, what do we miss by paying so much attention, and rightfully so in the city, to the brick and mortar of it all? What have we sort of lost that might have been ephemeral or cultural that went by the wayside while we kept the structures up? You want to start, closest?
Sure. Well, I think the moment when I first started thinking seriously about what buildings couldn't tell us was when I was working in San Francisco, Japantown. I was the historian on a neighborhood plan that the city had commissioned. We did a lot of community consultation and engagement, and when the team was ready to present our findings in a big community meeting, some of the no-brainer preservation tools that we were saying to the community we thought were appropriate, you know, landmarking this building, et cetera, people said, we're not interested in that. We don't want to landmark our buildings. In part, that had to do with Japanese Americans' understandable mistrust of government intervention in their neighborhood, which had only brought suffering before World War II and especially during World War II. They said, what we're really interested in is protecting our longtime businesses that are having difficulty competing with new businesses in San Francisco, or our churches that could use funding to keep the building going. And at that point, the city planners said, well, we only deal with bricks and mortar, so we can't help you. But in the last 10 years, as Stephen Goldsmith pointed out, San Francisco has become the land of anxiety and hypergentrification. And many neighborhoods, not just Japantown, residents of many neighborhoods are worried sick, literally, about how they're going to find a place to stay here. And so the city's been experimenting with several tools that I'll probably describe in more detail in a bit. But I think what we're missing when we just look at buildings are the stories, the activities that make places meaningful to people and that provide a legacy from which the future can be shaped.
So I'm thinking about the Black Gotham experience right now, and for folks who didn't have a lot of agency to actually create buildings, if we focus merely on the bricks and mortar of it all, where does that history even go?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of, I think go by the wayside, I like that as a phrasing, and bricks and mortar is a good place to start with, but before there was bricks and mortar, you're building on something. And New York City is a good example, almost as a document or a case study on the layers that urban environments or spaces in this hemisphere mean. I mean, you have, First Nations presence, you have a lot of times an African presence, you might have a colonial era before you have the United States of America, so to speak, in this particular country, in this particular city. But we have a very deliberate sense of erasure as well. And if you begin to start with what's only built, then you're already complicit in that erasure if you choose to not talk about what was there prior to when something was broken ground on in the 20th century or 19th century. And the presence of Black people on this island goes back 300 years before the Harlem Renaissance. And so if you just start by preserving what you can see, then you've basically, with or not trying to be complicit, you've co-signed the erasure of other people's cultural contributions. And that's a choice. We can choose to be complicit and just start with the building, or we can ask more questions and have a more rich, deeper understanding of where we are.
Dr. Jackson, I think your work gets at a very complicated intersection, especially your time of service at the national parks, where we're talking about an environment that is, for all intents and purposes, going to remain as it is, but introducing some very painful histories for some groups.
Yeah, and I think the whole notion of what is preserved in terms of mortar and pestle kind of things, the brick and mortar, what is a monument? And oftentimes what's built into the idea of a monument is the fact that these are grand structures. And so you leave out histories of everyday people who had houses, or maybe had enslaved cabins, regular houses like the Louis Armstrong Museum house in the Bronx. In Queens, yeah. And things like that. So these kinds of places where everyday people lived and had their life and made their living, maybe the sweetgrass basket making in terms of the environment where these people collected the grass and the straw and things like that. These are all histories and heritages of people that may not constitute what we call a monument, these grand structures that are actually valued as something to be preserved in the first place. So my work gets at those everyday stories, everyday interactions of people in place, and things that we may not count or may not count and have counted in the past as something to be worth preserving in that manner. And so we miss entire histories and heritages if we do not talk about the intangible in terms of people and how they actually live their everyday lives. And I think about the Jimmy Carter National Historic Site, where his boyhood home was in Archery, Georgia. And if you go to Archery, all you see is a gray dirt road leading to maybe just a church that's still there or a cemetery. But if you talk to the people, if you go to a May Day celebration, you find out so much about the life of the people in that community and how they influenced the life of a US president. It's all there, but that kind of stuff had not been even preserved by the Park Service until more recent times when they asked that I come in and do an ethnographic study of the living community and bring those stories now into what's preserved with Jimmy Carter's house and the schoolhouse that he went to. Those things are actually physically preserved, but the other things I'm talking about are less physical and more everyday life of people. And that's one of the examples of things that the Park Service has been doing more and more to preserve that kind of history and incorporate that in the national stories.
We should all be so lucky to say Jimmy Carter slept here, right? So Jane, I'm looking at you and thinking about your approach, looking at New York City, particularly the community garden piece, where you took something that might have been blight and turned it into a lung of a community and made a resource. And then someone tried to reclaim the thing and just where you are and introduce the ephemera sometimes of these murals that are giving life and color to community.
Well, most of the bricks that community gardeners deal with are the ones they find in the vacant lots that they're trying to clean up.
Yeah.
Because these were sites where buildings had been, and then because of one reason or another, they were demolished. And the prime motive for creating a community garden is to clean up their neighborhood. But then other factors take over. And one of those factors is to recreate a community, perhaps from where they came from. I'd like to say that I can go into a community garden and I can tell you who's gardening there, from the way the garden is designed, what's planted, and how it's used. And originally in New York City, the gardens were seen as temporary. And so people had to fight for their legitimacy. And that fight started as far back, well, when Green Thumb was started in 1976. I came in 1984, and we just began to evolve some protection measures. And it was not until 2002, the result of a negotiated settlement that came out of a court case when the Attorney General's office fought to stop the auction of 214 gardens, that policies that we worked very hard to promote were actually institutionalized. So now there are about 550 gardens that are protected, either in the Department of Parks or in other agencies. Now, with community murals, it's where people want to project a message. Pablo Neruda, the great Chilean poet, said that murals are the people's blackboard. And in a sense, they are a window into the unofficial history of a neighborhood. But community murals really are ephemeral. They don't last long, or perhaps they don't last long. There are lots of factors. But there are some murals that are very special, and to get them preserved creates all sorts of challenges, which probably we'll talk about later.
Well, can we pull on that thread of murals and preservation and Donna working in that idea of monuments as well, where we have this prejudice toward the awe-inspiring sort of things that are meant to make you think something just by their very being. But we're a few avenues away from Columbus Circle. Yesterday, we, depending on your state, celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day. And this question is ranking high on our little friend here, but how do we approach preserving a city's cultural identity from a standpoint that doesn't promote a one-sided view of history? And I'm looking at you guys and wondering, are you the ones to march in and mediate between people saying, this is our heritage versus this was a bad guy? You've only heard half of the story in trying to get at unpacking some of this notion of exactly what I just asked about preserving these things and also making sure the fullness of the historical experience is brought to the front.
Well, I think what Kamau brought up about the fact that any given site, pretty much in cities, has multiple layers of meaning and history that may not be reflected in whatever you're looking at today, is really fruitful, and that preservation programs, if they took the task of interpreting and storytelling and working with communities to understand those many layers more seriously, I think could build constituency, because they would multiply the amount of people who see themselves in these places around them in the built environment, and maybe even understand where there might be sites of tension that need to be discussed, sort of submerged tension, or let alone submerged histories, or places that speak to commonalities that can provide some sort of a different kind of platform for discussion.
I also think you have to acknowledge the fact that some histories and heritages were underrepresented, not represented at all, and taken out of the picture, not ever included.
Right.
So those kinds of things have to be accounted for in bringing voices or people's history back into the picture that was totally erased in the first place. So I think there is room for common ground, but there are also a lot of things that have to be made up. Lots of things in the National Park Service, they didn't have, women's voices were often excluded from all of these national monuments and things that we call national heritage. So we do have to recognize that women were there, they just were not part of the dialogue. And so we have to work to bring those back in. Same with African Americans, Native American stories and lives were excluded, taken out of the picture. So we can't, in trying to be totally inclusive, lose sight of the fact that we totally left people out in the first place.
So from a practical standpoint, how do you engage and mobilize and empower that constituency to realize the inherent value of their lived experience, their familial histories, to bring it to the front? Because most people are walking around with these things thinking that it's of no value to even their grandkids or someone who hasn't sat and listened to them. So is there a means by which we can sort of engage these folks and turn them into an army of the willing?
I think that we had a conversation when the day first started with public artists, and I think that this is where creatives step into the picture, but it doesn't end there. It doesn't have to only be artists. It could also be the public sector, the private sector, but you have to literally get in the streets to begin to add context, to braid both of those two questions together. I think that you have to be in the business of creating context and unpacking those layers of the public square and the psychic square, because whatever's in front of you at some point in time has already impacted your mind and your framework. And if somebody's built it, it's already been published in a book, or it's been heralded and christened by academia or put into media. So before you even see a Christopher Columbus statue, you already know who that person is, more than likely, if you've been educated in this country. Right. And so putting Columbus in context and understanding before 1492 that the actual castle he walked into was built by African Moors. Where's that conversation? It's redacted, it's omitted. And so you might think that Columbus is the first person to sail in the ocean. It's like, well, how can that be the case when for centuries people in Spain were dealing with a presence of African Muslims? But people are choosing to cut those kind of things out. And if you just rely on the public square to be determined by people that are in government, and you don't choose to be an active citizen and interpret and share and do your own research, then you're going to have a lopsided playing field in perpetuity. So I think it's important to get in the streets and be a part of the conversation, do your research, nerd out, and be active and push for those conversations to be more tangible.
You had something.
Well, in the case of community gardens, which is really kind of separate from some of the other examples, you had citizens, and then you had New York City government. And you had the desire for open space and recreation, and you had the need for housing. Mm-hmm. And so it was years of discussions and actually getting the city to recognize the value of the community gardens, the deep-rootedness, and how the gardens did coalesce a community. And this is all within the context of gentrification, because community gardens are in neighborhoods, usually marginal neighborhoods where there's lots of land. Right. And you fix up the land, and then it becomes attractive. It becomes attractive, and people want to move in. Well, they want new housing, and out goes the garden. So if you can get a policy, and there seems to be one now, where when there is development, gardens are planned. And even if gardens need to be removed during the building, they come back in and they function still as a grassroots effort, because the last thing you want is a top-down kind of garden, which is made for you. Yeah. It needs to be from the community. And they're coalitions, and there's a lot of lobbying. And there's been lobbying for 25, 30 years now in New York City, and it's that lobbying that has made a difference.
So Jane, this leads into something that's been getting a lot of traction here. So if not a formal landmark designation as like a public garden can now be like gone through the Parks Department, it's official, the land is here. So your perspective and you three, if not for a formal landmark designation, what regulatory tools exist to preserve cultural heritage?
So San Francisco is pioneering some new strategies looking at cultural heritage, not bricks and mortar, as an anti-gentrification tool. They're very new, and so they haven't really been in place long or had time to be assessed, but they're very interesting, and in part I think I was brought here to share them with you. One is called the Legacy Business Registry. In part, stemming from those conversations in Japantown where people said our mom and pop businesses need support to go on. The city and our local MAS, San Francisco Heritage, came up with the idea of a legacy registry that would honor businesses or nonprofits that were nominated because they gave their neighborhood identity. They had to be at least 30 years old, and they had to commit to keeping their name and their activity. Then the city residents voted for funding that could be used to meet the gap between market rate rental and what these businesses or nonprofits could pay. There are now over 100 businesses and nonprofits on this registry. I'm waiting, and I'm gonna start talking with the city about, there needs to be some body that's actually analyzing to see whether this works, but it's a really interesting experiment that I think is promising. The other tool that has just been formalized is the creation of, they're calling them cultural districts. And these are areas in the city of communities that have been historically marginalized and are vulnerable to this intense economic pressure that's happening across San Francisco. And there are now 6 of these cultural districts. I think they're problematic in that they are, at this point, are coming about because an advocate has gained the ear of an elected official who then will do their neighborhood a favor and say, okay, you're gonna get the Filipino cultural district here. You're gonna get the trans women of color here. You're gonna get the LGBTQ district here. But hardly any place in San Francisco is monolithic. So to draw a boundary and say, have the city say, this is the most important group of people here, and this is where not just city resources, but the ability to twist developers' arms is going to be centralized, I think sets up the many communities that are vulnerable to displacement right now kind of against each other. Yeah. So I think it's counterintuitive to a social justice mission when you're premiating one among many vulnerable communities.
So how do we scale this idea where the loudest voices in the room aren't the only ones who get the districts or the funding?
I think what they could be doing in San Francisco is looking at the neighborhoods that are most impacted right now by displacement and gentrification and do a kind of cultural heritage inventory and look at the many communities represented in that neighborhood and look at it as a more multiple voice place that where there are many groups of people that might benefit from what the city can do for them and from what forming coalitions might do for them.
I'm looking at you, Dr. Jackson. Send out your students. Make
Yeah,
us
that's
a
what
laboratory. How do we do it?
They have, at the university, we have community engagement projects, what we call it, and I actually have a Heritage Research Lab. And one of the things we do is partner with communities with a particular issue that they want resolved or something that they want preserved. And I use the resources, or we use the resources of the university, the students going out helping with doing archival research or doing record searches and things like that, helping train people how to do that or help do the legwork within communities to find out some of the histories that may be encased in some of these institutions. And then also go out and use the community as a knowledge resource, recognize them as the knowledge resources that they are in terms of who are these people, what are their oral histories, interviews, what has been going on, how do they document their own history and heritage of place, and record that and document that and make that accessible in the places where people are living. So we actually bring the university resources into community structures, community organizations, their historical societies or their community groups where they have, oftentimes it's churches, oftentimes it's recreation centers, but where people are. We meet people where they are, and students get a lot of energy and interest in these kinds of projects because they actually work with living people and they learn things that they hadn't heard or understood before because they're working on the ground with people. And people in the community understand the value of the knowledge that they have because they're sharing it with people who are asking questions and really seriously valuing their knowledge and their understanding of place. And so we do those kinds of things, and then the biggest thing is making that kind of information accessible where people are. We preserve it in their museums or in their cultural centers, create posters, create whatever kinds of documentation, low-tech, high-tech, whatever works for the community that's something that they want, not something that we want to do for them. So that's the kinds of, so each project could be different, each neighborhood is different, and we're very neighborhood, street, church level, I mean, very, very basic. And so that has one community at a time.
Yeah.
And that's how we get around some of these bigger structures, but use them.
I understand the Black Gotham Experience has a tour of New York City Hall. So this is a sort of perfect bridge for this question where you guys were in the lane and you were doing something. How did this partnership come into existence?
I mean, literally from being in the streets, thinking as an artist and as an entrepreneur, you have to have a lot of faith and belief in your service, product, mission. And since 2010, I've been, given walking tours about, Black history in New York at a time where people would just had that beach ball on a screen when you mentioned there was slavery in New York, 3-hour tour, and they're still you mean there were slaves in New York? They just kept going back to that. And then it's just New York City's named after James Stewart, Duke of York. It's he was a slave trader. Our city is named after a slave trader. It's not the South, the
Right.
North was a major part of slavery too. It's just been an amazing job of smoke and mirrors. And then when people come on the walking tour, and I mean, I've had provosts, I've had archivists, I've had a range of different people who come on the tours and we start having conversations.
How many times have you been corrected?
Or not even about being corrected as much as people, the beach ball shows up.
Okay.
And it's you ask people what have you seen of the first 100 years of New York? And people begin to answer the question and say, does Gangs of New York count? It's nah, that's 200 years later. Right, well, how about Stuyvesant or Hamilton? It's that's after. And it's they realize that there's so much missing.
Yeah.
And, history, I think that there was a analogy this morning by one of the artists who mentioned history's like food. And if history's presented in a way, it's I don't care, you could be the most racist person in the world. We know what cooked food smell like, you know what I mean? And people might lean into history in ways that will be surprising, and that's where we find all types of partnerships. And that doesn't mean that city government or businesses, but we have a range of partners that are big corporations or City Hall who say, we want to be a part of this conversation. Can we commission you to create a walking tour that opens up how Black history is a part of City Hall, even though you have all these glorious paintings of white men. And it's we could do that. And it makes sense. You just have to dig into the backstory, the origin story, and you tease those kind of things out, and it's yummy.
It's yummy. So Jane, I'm thinking about when those prevailing political winds may shift and all of a sudden you are not favored nation. How do you maintain space in a time where you may politically be on the outs?
Well, I think the fact that 375 gardens are now within the Department of Parks is a positive thing. However, none of those gardens are mapped as parkland. So things are a little fungible.
Right.
But I think that the prevailing winds are such that the gardens will stay. And there is enough, and now when there are development pressures, those projects have to go to the local community board. So there is a process involved where the gardeners can make a case and the community can make a case. and sometimes the development may not happen. I think probably more than gardens at this point, it's community murals that are so, what's the word that I'm looking for? At risk, vulnerable. They have always been described as something ephemeral, and some of them are very important to the life of the community. When people know I am interested in murals, they'll tell me about the mural in their neighborhood.
That used to be there, or is kind of...
Well, they'll tell me
Yeah.
where it was, what it was about. They remember when it was painted. They remember what happened to it, and they can tell you when it disappeared, if it did. The murals become really a part of the fabric of community life. And some municipalities, Chicago, Philadelphia in part, and Los Angeles, they all have municipal programs to help preserve the murals. In New York City, we don't have that. The few murals we have been able to preserve have been through major fundraising efforts, and even those are complicated. And right now, there is a mural on West 46th Street. It's the oldest community mural, and we're talking about brush murals, where I'm not talking about graffiti, I'm talking about collaborations between artists and community groups, the groups that kind of say, this is what we want our mural to project, the message. And there has been an effort to preserve this mural since 2012. It's now gone beyond that. The mural can no longer be restored.
So this is a question generated out there by Nancy, who's there. I don't know if it's for Nancy or no. So it's from Nancy. Why should a wave of immigrants want to preserve the culture of a previous occupation in that neighborhood? What's the rationale there? So I think that might get to a real sense of the way that things move in this city in particular, where you have gentrification and gentrification on steroids in some areas, and just the nature of the beast where people, this is a point of entry. So are we putting the burden on the new folks who are in the community to preserve something that is foreign to them?
I don't know if people in community gardens think in those terms. They really think in terms of vegetables in a safe place to come to for themselves, for their elders, and for their kids.
Well, this is a very San Francisco issue as well. You guys draw everyone from everywhere as well.
Right, and I think unless you're talking about a situation where a neighborhood is really being wiped clean in one fell swoop, which is rare, you're talking about something that is somewhat gradual and that hopefully there's public sector involvement in too, where it's not as if people come into a neighborhood and think of it as tabula rasa. What I work to do, sorry, I just whacked my microphone, is in preserving sites where the community may not be there any longer, think about what aspects of that story may speak to contemporary residents. I'm dealing with a historic 13 acres that were cut flower nursery in Richmond, California. It's across the bay from San Francisco. These were Japanese American cut flower nurseries. Now they're going to be senior housing and market rate housing. And in thinking about the history of labor there, the history of being a newcomer, it's a process of working with the community to think through themes that are meaningful to a broad group of people and how to tell stories that make many people see somebody else's stake in that place, but maybe see a reflection of their own stake where they're living or visiting or working.
So Dr. Jackson, I had a question about your work with young people. I know that it's a very fast-growing field, but I'm wondering if you can imagine the conversation between a student and their parent when they come home and say, yeah, heritage studies, that's my major.
Yeah, why? Like my parents asked me, why are you going into anthropology in particular? What is that? So it is a study of people and living cultures. I think the connection, I think that kind of heritage studies or heritage in general is anything a family on a family level, community level wants to preserve and bring forward into the future. And so I think that kind of intergenerational conversation that it encourages because that's part of the problem. There are a lot of disconnects between generations and having conversations. And I think this notion of heritage and how you connect the past and the present that's what it's about. And so having these conversations, I think when people start thinking of it as conversations and what do you bring forward into the present and into the future, I think it encourages conversations, and parents and families become more involved in this discussion and happy because that young people are asking them questions about their past and how to utilize some of those things in the present. And so that the distance between generations become less or more interconnected. So I think thinking of heritage as a conversation between the past and the present, the generations, intergenerational conversations, grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, and people you call family or create family is what heritage is about. And I think once we get to what it is, as opposed to just a word, people understand it more, become more engaged.
How important do you think it is in that bridging the past and the present and moving forward to the future that the voices of, you spoke about women earlier who were missing from a lot of these founding and pioneer narratives, the voices of people of color and other groups who folks would tell you are marginalized. How important is it that their stories continue to be a sort of separate parallel narrative? Are we at a point where we are gonna stop the tribalism and amend history as it is written?
I think because it's never been separate, and I think that's the whole point of all of us doing the work that we do, is that it has always been connected and integrated. And so it's the fact that we need to make these stories central, these histories central, part of the central dialogue. I don't necessarily think of the plantation, for example, plantation history as something separate that you only need to talk about one group or the other. I mean, it's a problem for the whole, a problem for the whole country,
right,
a nation, and it's a dialogue that needs to be had in unison, in conversation. I think because people have been having different conversations in their individual groups, that has created the problem. And I think the more we bring these stories not as separate, but as central, that's what I'm working to shift those dialogues, that this is not a separate story. The African American experience, the Native American experience, and women's experience are not separate from the major narrative, the main narrative. It is a narrative. So I think I'm not ever thinking of it as separate. I'm thinking that we need to talk about all of these things in one conversation.
So how do we amplify those voices to make sure that it's not the dominant sort of story where it becomes a whole story instead of, yeah, I went to history, but then on the weekend I had to take a walking tour to find out that, oh, Black people were present.
I mean, I'm have a lot of faith in the youth. We don't give them enough credit. And I'm hopeful also in people being able to peel back these, their own impediments to feeling connectivity. And when those firewalls begin to come down and you see that one thing does intersect with the other, it's not like you have to check a box and say, oh yeah, we included people of color and women and people who are non-binary sexually. You begin to just move those boxes and realize that these things already intersect and overlap. I remember I gave a tour to some delegates from the Netherlands, and they chose the Saturday they went. Actually, it was a Sunday, and it was during Pride weekend. And they were like, wow, this feels like Amsterdam. I was like, welcome to Pride in New York, right? And then as I began to talk about people that were of African descent working on building a Black community in the 1640s at a time when the First Nations were resisting, oppression from the Dutch. And then I talk about the person that was trans and of color who threw the first punch during Pride weekend, and then move all the way over to Washington Square Park, and then over to the Triangle Cherries Factory fire, then over to Broadway that was, an Indian trail before Black folks were building in the 1620s. It's this is not checking boxes. It's the public square that is denied to us because the narratives don't support the conversation people wanted to have during the height of cotton plantations. And so all we have to do is just tease back the propaganda, and those connectivity, all those elements are there already. And it's a more interesting, delicious story than just like one thing. You know, it's just like, it's a lot, the lives are usually boring, which is why they have to have a budget.
So a moment ago, you spoke about those fortunate folks from Amsterdam who happened upon Pride in New York City. But we got a question about preserving ephemeral experiences of our current lives for future historians. So I'm wondering what each of your approaches to those things are for what we have right now. I know my phone is constantly in my pocket. We live in the most well-documented life ever. But are there ways that we can institutionalize that into something that's not so ephemeral?
Well, San Francisco right now has just finished creating an LGBTQ cultural heritage strategy to kind of answer that, to surface what are the most important cultural dimensions of queer life in San Francisco that community members want to maintain and want city support if they can get it, with the understanding that that's also going to evolve. I think that's always the tension, that you want to support the enactment of this rich culture, but you don't want to freeze it. Not sure I answered your question, but.
Are we going down the line?
I was gonna say, if anyone else wants to get it, I got a million more questions here.
Yeah,
so.
I would just say briefly that I think
Yeah.
it's important to focus on the human component of all this. I mean, I think if we just focus on street names and what's built without focusing on our own humanity and what we think and how we feel and how we treat each other, I think that the culture is the most important monument that we all can create. And that's ephemeral, but it's like the power behind, you know, what makes things work is the culture. So I think that elevating the culture as the most important monument we all can make, and it'll manifest in other ways and be more sustained over time.
And recognizing that change that's what we are as humans. It's not necessarily, heritage is not something that's static, it's dynamic. And so we're always going to be recreating, creating, reaching back, reaching forward. And so not trying to box it in. I think that's another thing that we have to recognize, that it's things are changed and people and celebrate the humanity of it, and it's in the moment too as well. So that's a big part of heritage.
So Jane, I know I was speaking to you earlier about the parks and the struggle to get these land and these plots recognized by the municipality here in New York. And I'm wondering, just for all of you guys, is there, you know, citizen scientist has a set of principles now that we all get, and, you know, it's codified. You go out there, you measure this, you count these things. Is there a way or an approach moving forward so this, one, the knowledge base doesn't go with the people, and number two, just to make it something that is quantifiable, or a set of practices where we can enlarge the folks who are doing it and be repositories for these stories?
We worked very hard to set a series of milestones the gardeners would need to meet that would make them eligible for parks. And that worked really well, and everybody has bought into that. I think, getting back to the other question, it's about stories. Because with the murals, back in, I guess it was the late 1990s, we realized that many of the murals, hundreds of the murals that had been painted from 1970 until that point were disappearing. And it was one thing to lose the mural, but what would happen if we lost the story behind the mural? And that's what led to a 10-year research project on my part with a colleague and a book. And then there was an exhibition, a couple of exhibitions on different aspects of murals. So I think any time you can bring something that's concrete to remember what took place with the stories behind it, because it's the stories which makes it so alive.
Well, speaking of those stories, we're closing in on our last 3 minutes. So I just wanted to see if any of you want to touch this idea of stealing something from the dominant culture. something that they've done really well to preserve their stories and their histories and even their monuments, that people who are interested in this cultural heritage, these like brief moments of human existence, could do to appropriate what's already been used and working for a very select group of people for a very, very long time.
Do you have something in mind?
I just had a question. No, but I'm saying, is there something that we can take that has demonstrated workability? And people have been asking, like, where are places that do this well? Like, is there, like, I think that plan in San Francisco is genius, but are there other places around the world that we can say that one, more of that over here?
But why does it have to be a dominant culture?
Because they get preserved. They perpetuate themselves and go on, in my opinion, but correct me.
I would just associate myself with Jane's earlier comments about storytelling. I think that that's where culture comes from, and stories. It's the software of humanity, so to speak. It's like, it is technology. You know what I mean? Even if you have like all the iPhones in the world or the internet, but like take all the pictures off of it, or like take the words off, and what do you have? I think that no matter what we create or develop or what we build, storytelling and sharing stories, whatever the campfire is, whether it's like an actual fire or it's a hashtag, I think coming together and sharing stories and feeling commonality is how you preserve anything. I don't care what you build. You can build something and then lie about it.
And recognizing your knowledge is valuable. Everybody's knowledge at the community level, the family level, people's knowledge is valuable. And oftentimes we've been conditioned that there is a hierarchy and certain people have the knowledge and the knowledge is amongst us. And so I think building that up and having people recognize that that knowledge is worth preserving in any way they can do it.
Well, this is why technology has been so good in allowing for podcasts and all these wonderful ways of Radio Lab, where you can tell, our Story Lab, where people can tell their stories. Because until recently, those stories weren't told.
Yeah. All right, we need an army of Dave Isays out there still recording it up. So in our last 20 seconds, I'm gonna thank you for all of your questions that you guys helped to push forward, and I thank our panelists for joining us today. Again, they were Donna Graves, Kamau, Ware, Antoinette Jackson, Dr. Antoinette Jackson, and Jane Weissman. Thanks for joining us.